The Springboks beat Namibia 57-3 on Saturday and remain on track for a Rugby World Cup quarterfinal place. But that was nowhere near the story of the weekend. We saw Japan stun Ireland. We saw Australia and Wales play out to an absolute humdinger. And this Rugby World Cup has been blown wide open. I'm joined in studio by Rob Houwing once again. Morning, Rob.
Hello, Lloyd.
Let's start with the Springboks. 57-3, 9 tries to zip. I suppose a good performance, probably not at their clinical best, South Africa, but job done. Bonus point in the bag. Just performance-wise, what you took out of that game?
I'd say, Lloyd, sort of a 6.5 out of 10, so plenty of pluses. Still just a little bit of a feeling that the Boks haven't quite got that sort of total mix right, that sort of complete dynamism to their rugby. I thought that was still lacking a little bit. We know that they scored a couple of sort of rumbling maul tries, which is an old Springbok speciality. Perhaps a little bit disappointing against a sort of a minnow side. You'd like to still see them just sort of stretch the ball to the wings through this midfield a little bit more sort of fluidly than they did. But, you can't really complain too much. The conditions are still quite a leveler, and Namibia did a lot to try and sort of suck the energy out of the game, if you like, with sort of, tactical sort of stoppages and the ice pack coming on, etc., etc. You could see that they were pretty intent on keeping the score down. Maybe the little disappointment to the fact that the Springboks didn't close it out that efficiently in the last 20, when Namibia also had a man in the bin, and South Africa only scored, I think, 1 try in the last quarter, which is a little disappointing when they'd done all the groundwork early on, which is a little bit of a message in itself that their perfection is still a little bit of a sort of an elusive quality for Rassie Erasmus's team. But, still plenty to work on, but lots of positives too. I mean, a very strong pack performance, very dominant 8. Skalk Brits doing a very decent job, I thought, in his daring capacity as a number 8, just because he's just such a generally very good cerebral rugby player. And plenty of others actually stuck their hands up for, a good shots at the A team sort of going forward. So on the whole, I don't think there's too much for Bok fans to stress about.
And then Japan, Ireland on Saturday. I mean, just an absolutely stunning result. Completely what the tournament needed. We've been talking a lot about some of these pool games being a bit too predictable. And then the host nation throws up a result like that and a performance like that. I mean, the intensity they showed on defense, the intensity of the crowd for 80 minutes. Ireland just without any answers, I guess, towards the end of that. And Japan putting in one of the great World Cup performances. I mean, is that exactly what this tournament needed, to throw that pool wide open?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the dream thing from a World Rugby perspective is that they'll be incredibly happy that Japan got such a stirring result, because the amount of sort of energy it puts into the whole sort of Japanese sort of psyche around the World Cup. Apparently, the Japanese newspapers were suddenly full of rugby after that sort of really epic win. And the really fantastic thing was that they actually deserved it. I thought they came from 12-3 down and gradually just got a stronger and stronger foothold against much more fancied opponents. Yeah. And Ireland really just ran out of ideas. They were kind of clinging on for dear life in a sense. It's not as though they were hammering away at the death. If anything, it was Japan, looking for an even bigger result. So it was a tremendous result, a real earth-shattering one for the tournament as a whole. And you and I have been discussing a little bit in some of our stories and so on about the fact that the World Cup it does have a little bit of a history for being a little bit formulaic, where you can often look at a Rugby World Cup, at the outset, and kind of pinpoint which big teams are going to knock over which minnows, etc., and then work out your quarterfinals fairly comfortably. That's now not quite so easy to do for this one, which is a great development. Fantastic for the tournament as a whole, and it also showed how Japan are going to be a force, because they're so attuned to the conditions. They obviously do all their training, all their match play. They're incredibly well conditioned, cohesive side. They play for each other. There are no superstars. They all play for each other. And the stifling humidity actually, I think, works in their favor against some of those the teams, especially from the sort of western part of the northern hemisphere, who are more used to playing sort of slow grinding, heavy pitch games in winter, suddenly finding this kind of almost like tropical humidity quite hard to deal with. So just wondering if the sort of the challenge from the Six Nations orientated sides is perhaps under a little bit more of a threat than some might have imagined at the tournament, although there's a long way to go.
Yeah, that definitely looked like towards the end of it they had a lot left, a lot more in the tank than the Irish did. I mean, some of those hits towards the back end, double hits, just knocking them backwards, that defensive line just rushing up. There was a lot of energy in their whole performance. And of course, what it does is there's now the possibility of a Springbok-Japan quarterfinal should Japan go on to top that pool. There's obviously a lot that needs to happen before we get that dream match. But how big would that be? I mean, given what happened in 2015, given that the Japanese public has taken to the Springbok team so well, it really is a dream quarterfinal should we get it.
Yeah, look, Rassie Erasmus was very clever in the aftermath of that result, very quickly saying, look, if we suddenly are playing Japan, it's going to be a toughie. But let's not beat about the bush. The Boks would far prefer to play Japan than Ireland, I'm pretty sure. So he was just getting in his right sort of psychology early. We would still love that to be the outcome. I'm not too convinced yet that is what's going to be the case. Japan still have it all to do. All they need are basic wins without bonus points against both Samoa and Scotland to be sure of topping the group. So it suddenly has become incredibly feasible. Whether it actually happens, I'm not so sure. I think even the Samoa game for the Japanese is going to be pretty 50-50. And then they've got their final game against Scotland right at the end of pool play. That could be the big decider. They've never beaten Scotland. We have to keep that in mind. I think it's 7 from 7 in Scottish favour bilaterally. So we've got to keep that in mind. It's not going to be an easy task. So a lot still has to happen for South Africa versus Japan in a quarter-final. But yes, it is a far likelier scenario than it was ahead of the weekend.
In 2015, Japan won 3 out of their 4 pool games at the World Cup and didn't qualify, which is a hell of unlucky. Yeah. And they obviously could do it again. I mean, potentially, if things don't go well, hopefully that won't happen for them this time around. And then, Rob, we saw the Wallabies and Wales share an absolute humdinger on Sunday. Australia falling short at the end, but that second half comeback from, I think, 15 or 16 points down, suggesting that moving through the tournament, they can step up and be really big players as well.
I went for an Australian win before the game. It was one of those matches that was really, really difficult to try and predict. I went Australia by 3. It ended up being Wales by 4. But as we know, they were hanging on for grim death at the end. I really thought that Australia had grabbed a massive foothold on that game as we got to sort of the 3-quarter mark, and you could see that the Welsh were running out of puff a little bit. Having said that, still a decent result for Wales. We can't write them off. You know, they are the Six Nations champions. And will be, I think, right up there come the quarterfinals. They're pretty sure to be the 2 teams going through from that group. So, you know, anything's possible there. But as you say, I do like the look of this Australian side. I don't think that they'll be shattered too much by the outcome. They did produce quite a significant comeback. And I think they look a lot steelier than they have done in the last few years, not just in sort of World Cups, but also in the Rugby Championship, for instance. So they're still at the races, Australia, very much, and not too many teams would fancy playing them. As you say, there are still certain individuals who are decent. Michael Hooper did have an absolutely outstanding game. He's like he's an open-sider with a blindsiders kind of mentality, if you like, because he really goes in for those big hits. And of course, he's an absolute terrier on the deck with David Pocock. And if they are playing at their very best against anybody, we've seen this season how they knocked over New Zealand in Perth on a really good day. Australia right up there with anyone. So it all adds to the general sort of excitement around that last 8 of the World Cup.
Very interesting dynamic again in that game yesterday with the referee. We saw Hooper, Pocock throughout that game, just really pushing the envelope, pushing Poit as far as they possibly could. And then after the game, we see Michael Cheika come out, and he has a lot to say about refereeing in general, saying he doesn't quite understand the rules himself anymore. Then we have Steve Hansen coming out this morning saying, guys, listen, it's enough now, hands off, just leave the referees alone, let them do their job, which is easy to say when you're winning, I suppose. But it just doesn't seem to be going away, does it? I mean, game after game, week after week, we still find ourselves having these discussions about referees. Again, it's just going to keep going throughout the tournament, do you think?
It will. There is so much murkiness around the laws at this stage. I think they need a comprehensive revisit after the World Cup, frankly. It probably is something that should have happened ahead of the World Cup. between the last two sort of World Cup cycles, I've sensed more and more of a sort of problematic leaning to where, even some really classical rugby encounters, instead the sort of the major distraction afterwards has been discussion around officials, which should never be the case in any sport really. It just happens far too often. I think almost the sort of the refereeing seedings, if you like, are still a little bit questionable. I still think that you've got really top-notch officials like Nigel Owens, Wayne Barnes, who during this tournament have sometimes been getting, up to this point anyway, slightly lesser matches, when in fact they are the ones who a lot of neutrals in World Rugby would love to see sort of policing the bigger games. The problem I have with someone like Romain Poit is that, in some ways he's very good. There are times when he does pick up the sort of the right nuances, lets the play flow to an acceptable extent. But he also, there is a communication issue, I think, and that sometimes causes a massive sort of drag out in a game where you sort of stop and you listen to him trying to interpret what's being said to him from the TMO booth in English, clearly, and he's trying to sort of, take it back out of his French mind into English, if you like, and it makes for a slightly slow, cumbersome process. So it's a difficult one. I mean, the issue, the real grey area is around the tackle laws and what constitutes a high or a dangerous tackle. So many double standards at play. You get some players being cited for what look like reasonably innocuous offences, and then you see a really blatant, cynical charge being completely just ignored. So rugby fans the world over are a little bit irked by the sort of subjectiveness, if you like, of refereeing, and that can't be a good thing. As I say, it does need a massive World Rugby revisit after this World Cup.
And I think World Rugby, from what we've heard from them, it sounds like they're aware of that as well, that they're going to go down that road. Just going back to the Springboks, Rob, Italy on Friday now. The banana peel in the group for South Africa, need to win that game. They did lose to Italy 3 years ago under Alistair Coetzee, so that might be lingering at the back of their mind somewhere. You would expect Rassie to go back to complete full strength for that game?
He will, I'm pretty sure. I think he's made his policy fairly clear about which games he was going to target for a sort of dirt trackers, if you like. I know some people don't like that expression, but that is how things work when you're on tour, and you decide that you're going to leave the nucleus of your sort of first 15, if you like, on the bench or in the stands even for certain matches, certain obvious matches, and then reinstate them for others. Especially given the sort of the grueling nature of the conditions at the World Cup, it is important that you rotate as cleverly as possible. And so, sort of one match on, one match off for your sort of A team and your B team, if you like, is the way to go. And I've got no doubt that he will go back to pretty close to that sort of A formula. It is possible his A side will be, unchanged from the team that went down to the All Blacks, in the knowledge that the Boks didn't play that badly against New Zealand and really had opportunities to win it. So I don't think it'll be panic stations. Having said that, of course, certain players from the Namibian game stuck their hands up for sort of senior status. I thought guys like Bongi Mbonambi, Lloyd Burnard, a little bit of a resurgence in Frans Steyn, although he's not perhaps the full sort of Monty yet in terms of his own capabilities, but at least he got through sort of a full 80 and looked pretty decent. So a few things to sort of mull over, but I don't think that Rassie is going to sort of let the tiller sort of shake too violently at this stage. I think he likes to keep that steady hand, and I think that'll be reflected in selection for the Italy game.
Were there any individuals in the Namibia game who are outside of the so-called A-team 23 who you think put their hand? They probably didn't do themselves too many favours. I mean, you look at a guy like Elton, who probably had his poorest Bok game in a while, at the worst possible time for him when he's trying to get into that match day 23. Warwick Galant with a little opportunity to get one over Willie Leroux, probably a little bit too error-ridden and, too many mistakes in his game. And then poor Spoon Corsi on the right wing just didn't get the ball the whole game. He's a guy who's been, now you would think, closing in on Makazole Mepimpi for pushing for a starting place in that Springbok team, and just didn't get the ball against Namibia. So anyone outside of the match day 23 that played against New Zealand that you think maybe can break into the team for Italy?
It is possible. I mean, I think that someone like Elton, as you mentioned, there's a lot of controversy about the fact that he hasn't been in the match 23 at all, and some people believing that we should actually have a specialist fly half on the bench rather than the sort of Frans Steyn option at 10. which I'm not sure is a good one. I don't think 10 is France's natural position. A lot of people saying that, Pollard can shift quite seamlessly to inside centre if you were to bring someone like Elton Jantjies off the bench. But the big drawback was that Elton did have a poor game, unfortunately, against Namibia. No two ways about it. I thought he made some errors at key times, didn't really take control behind a very dominant pack and against pretty second-tier opposition. So a chance missed big time, and that was unfortunate. A couple of other players, I think someone like Bongi is really pushing very hard against Malcolm Marx. Malcolm Marx, as we know, is the big heavyweight, the sort of sensational arrival on the scene 2 or 3 years ago, who has perhaps just sort of plateaued out a little bit and needs to be a little bit careful. I think he's still got tremendous qualities, don't get me wrong, but Bongi Mbonambi is just such a tiger every time he comes on the park off that bench. So he's pushing, to get into that first team, not just as a bench presence, but to actually wear the number 2 jersey. But as I say, I think it's going to be last chance saloon for a few players against Italy, an opportunity for certain guys to nail down their places, and I think all those players will be well aware of it because there's quite a strong squad ethic. Everyone knows in that Bok setup that most of their positions are under at least some degree of threat, and that the players will be asked to sort of react accordingly.
And then finally, Rob, does the Japan result, should Springbok fans be a little bit more concerned about a side like Italy now, having witnessed what happened between Japan and Ireland over the weekend? I mean, does that chance of an upset, a tournament-ending upset, still exist, or should Bok fans kind of rest easy in the build-up to the Italy game?
Yeah, yes and no. I still have a sense that the Springboks are capable of knocking over Italy by 15 to 20 points, perhaps at a minimum, if they really have put their minds to it. That's going to be the key. Put their minds to the task, really take on Italy physically. The Italians have got some pretty robust individuals in their pack. And some good strong ball carriers, so the Boks have got to be a little bit careful there. And of course, we have historically there is that one defeat against Italy, that little sort of blot on the copybook historically against them to think about. But the fact that that's happened is perhaps not a bad thing. That the Boks will be on their guard for lightning striking twice. I don't think it'll happen. I still think that if the Springboks put their mind to it properly, they should put away Italy reasonably comfortably, possibly even with a bonus point for the little that it matters.